There are moments in history when the universe pivots on the will of a single soul, and there are beings so vast in their ambition that they reshape reality itself. Imagine standing at the edge of a precipice where the light of 10,000 suns converges into a single point of golden fire, where the weight of humanity's survival rests upon shoulders that have carried it for over 40,000 years. This is not a story of heroes and villains in the way you understand them. This is the chronicle of a being who walked among humanity before the first cities rose from the dust, who witnessed empires bloom and collapse like flowers in the span of a breath, who orchestrated the greatest conquest the galaxy has ever known, and who now sits entombed in agony, neither living nor dead, holding back the tide of damnation with nothing but the fading embers of his will. The Emperor of mankind is not a god, though trillions pray to him as one. He is not a man, though he was born of Terra's ancient soil. He is the culmination of humanity's greatest hope and its most tragic hubris, a psychic colossus whose very existence tears at the fabric of space and time, and whose silence speaks louder than any words could ever convey. You think you know his story because you've heard the hymns, seen the icons, read the propaganda scrawled across a million worlds. But the truth is far stranger, far older, and far more terrible than any sermon could ever capture. This is the story of how a single immortal guided humanity from the shadows of prehistory, how he revealed himself in mankind's darkest hour, how he built an imperium that stretched across the stars, and how his greatest triumph became his eternal damnation. Before we descend into the labyrinthine depths of this saga, before we walk the blood-soaked halls of the imperial palace and stand witness to the birth and death of empires, I need you to do something. If you've ever wondered what it truly means to bear the weight of an entire species, if you've ever questioned what sacrifice looks like when stretched across millennia, then this story is for you. Hit that like button, because this is the kind of content that takes time, research, and a genuine love for the grim darkness of the far future to create. Share this with anyone who's ever been curious about Warhammer 40K, anyone who's been intimidated by the sheer scale of the lore, or anyone who just wants to understand why this universe has captivated millions. And subscribe, because we're going deeper into the Imperium's mysteries, its heroes, its horrors, and its unanswered questions in every video we make. This is just the beginning of your journey into the 41st millennium, and trust me, once you see how deep this rabbit hole goes, you'll never look at science fiction the same way again. Now, let's begin where all legends begin, in the shadows before history had a name. The world was young when he first opened eyes that would never close, born in a time so distant that even the shape of the continents was different, when the inland sea that would one day become the Mediterranean was just beginning to breach the land bridge and flood the basin with the fury of geological time. Imagine trying to measure the age of a being who predates written language, whose earliest memories are of a humanity that knew fire but not bronze, whose childhood was spent among tribes who believed that thunder was the voice of angry spirits and that the sun might one day choose not to rise. The shamans saw it coming, those prehistoric seers whose connection to the warp was raw and unfiltered, untainted by the later corruption that would poison that realm. They could feel the predators circling in the Imperium, entities that would one day be called demons, but which then were simply the hungry shadows that fed on human souls as they passed from life to whatever came after. These shamans understood that their time was ending, that humanity was becoming too numerous and too psychically active for individual souls to slip unnoticed through the warp to reincarnation, and so they did something unprecedented in its audacity and its horror. They gathered in a place that memory has long since forgotten, perhaps in the caves of what would become Anatolia, perhaps in the shadow of mountains that have since worn to hills, and they enacted a ritual of supreme sacrifice. Each shaman took their own life, casting their souls into the roiling chaos of the warp not to reincarnate but to merge, to combine into a single gestalt consciousness so powerful that it could anchor itself back into reality, into a child born of mortal woman but carrying within it the psychic might of thousands. That child was him. That child would never die. Picture the loneliness of it, the absolute isolation of watching everyone you have ever known age and crumble to dust while you remain unchanged. He walked through the Neolithic knowing that every friendship was temporary, every love doomed to end in the grief of watching mortal flesh fail. He could not afford to remain in one place for too long, could not allow any community to notice that he did not age, that wounds which should have killed him closed and healed as if time itself ran backwards across his flesh. And so he wandered, moving from tribe to tribe, from the Fertile Crescent to the Indus Valley, from the Yellow River to the early settlements along the Nile. Everywhere he went, he taught. He showed them better ways to shape flint, introduced crop rotation before agriculture had even fully developed, guided their understanding of the seasons and the stars. But he was careful, always careful, to appear as simply a wise man, a stranger with useful knowledge but nothing that would mark him as something other than human. There were moments when he must have been tempted to reveal himself, to use the full scope of his psychic might to impose order on the chaos of early human civilization, but he understood something fundamental that he would later forget in his arrogance. That humanity had to grow at its own pace, that wisdom forced upon a people never takes root the way wisdom earned through struggle does. The Bronze Age saw him moving more openly among the great civilizations, though still he wore his immortality like a cloak that could be shrugged off when necessary. He was there in Sumer when the first cuneiform tablets were pressed into wet clay, there in Egypt during the Old Kingdom, teaching the principles of engineering that would allow the pyramids to rise. Some scholars of the 41st millennium, those few with access to the most forbidden archives, whisper that he was Gilgamesh, that the epic of the king who sought immortality was a garbled account of the emperor's own search for purpose in a life that would not end. Others say he was the mysterious pharaoh Akhenaten, who attempted to impose monotheism on Egypt and whose radical reforms were erased from history after his death. The truth is he was probably neither and both. Not the kings themselves, but the advisors who whispered in their ears, the priests who interpreted omens in ways that steered entire nations toward stability rather than collapse. He saw the Bronze Age collapse coming, that cascade of catastrophes around 1200 BCE that saw the great empires of the Eastern Mediterranean fall within a single century, and he did what he could to preserve knowledge, to ensure that the darkness would not be total, that humanity would claw its way back to civilization rather than slip into permanent barbarism. Through classical antiquity he moved like a ghost through history's margins, present at the great turning points but never center stage. He walked through Athens at the height of its golden age and despaired at how quickly human reason could turn to hubris and self-destruction. He was in Rome, perhaps as a senator, perhaps as a general, watching the Republic devour itself and birth an empire that would carry the seeds of its own decay from the moment of its inception. He understood cycles, the way civilizations rise and fall with a rhythm as predictable as the tides, and it must have filled him with a frustration beyond words. Every lesson had to be relearned, every mistake repeated, because mortal humans could not carry the weight of institutional memory across the centuries the way he could. The great library of Alexandria burned, and with it went knowledge he had spent centuries helping to accumulate. The Western Roman Empire fell, and Europe descended into fragmentation and feudalism. He could have stopped it, perhaps. He had the power to impose order through sheer psychic might, to crown himself God-Emperor and rule openly. But something held him back, some understanding that the time was not yet right, that humanity had to exhaust other possibilities before it would accept the kind of unification he envisioned. The medieval period must have been particularly galling, watching superstition and dogma strangle the scientific curiosity that had begun to bloom in the classical world. He worked where he could, preserving texts in monasteries, funding alchemists whose work would lay the groundwork for chemistry, appearing in dreams to mathematicians and astronomers to nudge them toward discoveries that would take centuries to fully flower. The Black Death swept through Europe, killing a third of the population, and he walked among the dying, immune to the pestilence, learning everything he could about plague and contagion because he knew that knowledge was humanity's only true weapon against the indifferent cruelty of the universe. The Renaissance was his doing, or at least partially so, the result of carefully preserved knowledge suddenly becoming available again, of patronage extended to artists and inventors through intermediaries who never knew they were serving an immortal's agenda. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, filled with designs centuries ahead of their time, bear the hallmarks of inspiration that came from something other than pure human genius, though whether the emperor met Leonardo personally or simply guided his dreams is something that will never be known. As humanity entered the Age of Enlightenment, he began to allow himself to hope that perhaps the species was finally ready to move beyond superstition, that reason and science might provide the foundation for the unity he had always envisioned. He was there when Newton formulated the laws of motion, there when Lavoisier laid the groundwork for modern chemistry, there in the coffeehouses of London and the salons of Paris where intellectuals debated the nature of rights and governance. The American and French revolutions fascinated him, the idea that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed rather than divine right or simple force of arms. But he also saw how quickly revolutionary ideals could curdle into terror, how the same impulse toward equality could lead to the guillotine and the reign of terror. Humanity was capable of such brilliance and such atrocity, often in the same breath, and the longer he lived the more he understood that both were inseparable aspects of the species he had sworn to protect. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world at a pea but the stars, when humanity finally reached them during the age of technology, brought horrors that even he had not fully anticipated. The development of warp travel and navigators allowed mankind to spread across the galaxy, to establish colonies on thousands of worlds, to build a federation of planets that seemed on the verge of achieving everything he had worked toward for millennia. And then it all fell apart. The emergence of psychers in the human population accelerated, drawing the attention of entities in the warp that had been growing stronger as sentient emotion fed them across the eons. The birth of Slaanesh, the youngest and most terrible of the Chaos Gods, tore a wound in reality that would never heal, creating the Eye of Terror and triggering psychic shockwaves that plunged the galaxy into the Age of Strife. Warp travel became impossible as storms raged through the Imperium. Colonies were cut off from each other, from Terra, from any hope of rescue. Nightmarish entities poured through the minds of rogue psychers, turning entire worlds into demonic playgrounds. The artificial intelligences that humanity had relied upon turned on their creators in a war so catastrophic that the very concept of thinking machines would be anathema for the next 10,000 years. Terra itself descended into barbarism as nuclear and biological weapons reduced the once verdant cradle of humanity to an irradiated wasteland ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who squatted in the ruins of the civilization they had destroyed. Ace unprecedented in history, and he was there in the factories and the laboratories, sometimes as an investor, sometimes as an inventor, always pushing for the advancement that would eventually lead humanity to the stars. The Emperor watched all of this with the patience of someone who had already lived for 30,000 years and knew that all things, even catastrophes, eventually end. He retreated into the most secure laboratories deep beneath the mountains that would one day become the Imperial Palace, and he began to work on the projects that would define the next era of human history. He studied genetics, pushing the science far beyond anything even the dark age of technology had achieved, because he understood that humanity in its current form was simply not capable of surviving in a galaxy that wanted to devour it. He would need warriors, but not ordinary soldiers. He would need generals, but not ordinary men. And so he began the work of creating the Primarchs, 20 genetic templates forged from his own genetic code, each one designed to embody a particular aspect of warfare, of leadership, of the qualities humanity would need to reclaim the stars. He also began work on the Imperial Webway, a project so ambitious that it made everything else seem like a preparatory sketch. If he could grant humanity access to the Webway, the ancient network of tunnels through reality that the Eldari had built at the height of their power, then the species would never again be dependent on warp travel, never again be at the mercy of the entities that dwelt in that nightmare realm. It would take time, decades, or even centuries, but time was the one resource he possessed in abundance. And while he worked, Terra burned, and humanity screamed, and the Emperor prepared to step from shadow into light for the first time in his impossibly long life. Terra in the 29th millennium was not a world but a wound, a planet so scarred by warfare that its very geology had been rewritten by the ambitions of petty tyrants who called themselves kings and emperors without understanding what those words truly meant. The oceans had boiled away or been reduced to toxic sludge that glowed faintly in the dark, the forests were ash and memory, and the air itself tasted of metal and burning plastic. The population huddled in hive cities and fortress nations, each one ruled by a warlord who commanded through a combination of scavenged Dark Age technology and brutal charisma. These were not civilizations but survivalist tribes wearing the corpse of civilization like ill-fitting armor, and they spent as much time fighting each other as they did trying to survive the radiation storms and mutant predators that roamed the wastes. The Emperor emerged from his hidden laboratory in the Himalayan mountains with an army behind him, but more importantly, with a vision that would allow no compromise and no alternative. Humanity would be unified under a single banner, the divisions that had crippled it for all of recorded history would be erased, and Terra would serve as the foundation for an Imperium that stretched to the stars. Those who joined him willingly would be welcomed. Those who resisted would be destroyed with such totality that their names would be erased from memory and their cities reduced to fused glass. The Thunder Warriors were the first of his gene-forged soldiers, and they were magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Each stood a head taller than the tallest baseline human, their bodies enhanced far beyond what natural evolution could achieve, their strength capable of tearing through ceramite plate as if it were paper. They wore crude power armor that howled with the strain of containing their aggression, and they wielded weapons that had been lost during the Age of Strife, Volkite calivers that disintegrated flesh with beams of thermal energy, plasma weapons that burned with the fury of caged stars. But for all their might, the Thunder Warriors were flawed, their genetic modifications too crude, too hastily implemented, leading to psychological instability and cellular degeneration that meant none of them would live to see their 50th year. The Emperor knew this when he created them, accepted it as the cost of moving quickly, and used them anyway because the unification wars could not wait for perfection. They swept across the Pan-Pacific like a storm of gold and crimson, annihilating the tyrants who ruled there in less than a year. The Ethnarchy, a nation of genetically modified super-soldiers who had ruled the northeastern wastes for centuries, fell in a campaign that lasted barely 6 months, their leaders executed and their territories absorbed into the growing Imperium. The Unspeakable King, a warlord whose name was forbidden to be spoken and whose crimes were so heinous that even in the grim darkness of the 29th millennium he stood out, was hunted down and killed in single combat by the Emperor himself, and his palace fortress was leveled so thoroughly that not even rubble remained. But the Emperor understood that conquest alone does not build civilizations, that force must be followed by infrastructure, by governance, by the slow work of turning disparate populations into a cohesive whole. As his armies moved across Terra, he established the first institutions of the Imperium, the bureaucratic machinery that would grow over the next 10,000 years into a labyrinth so complex that no single individual could comprehend its full scope. The administratum began as a simple office tasked with managing supply lines and troop movements, but it grew with every conquered nation, absorbing the record keepers and scribes of defeated enemies, learning from their systems and incorporating the best elements into an ever-evolving whole. The early Mechanicum, the tech priests of Mars who had survived the Age of Strife by worshipping the machines they no longer fully understood, signed the Treaty of Olympus Mons, agreeing to ally with Terra in exchange for autonomy over the Red Planet and the right to continue their religious practices. It was a compromise that both sides knew was imperfect, but the Emperor needed the Mechanicum's manufacturing capacity and their knowledge of Dark Age technology, and the tech priests needed protection from the warp storms that still occasionally lashed the Sol system. The Space Marines were already in development, the next generation of transhuman warriors who would surpass the Thunder Warriors in every way, their genetic modifications stable, their augmentations refined through lessons learned in blood. The Imperial Palace rose from the bones of the Himalayan mountains, a structure so vast that it would eventually cover as much area as a continent, its spires reaching into the upper atmosphere where the air was thin enough that baseline humans could not survive without augmentation. The earliest sections were brutal and functional, fortresses designed to withstand siege by armies wielding weapons that could crack tectonic plates, but even then there was an aesthetic to the construction, a sense that this was not merely a military installation but the foundation of something grander, a seat of power worthy of an empire that would span the galaxy. The Emperor walked the construction sites himself, sometimes laboring alongside the workers, and those who saw him in those moments spoke of a being who seemed genuinely concerned with the well-being of those he ruled, who would stop to listen to a laborer's complaint about poor equipment and ensure that it was rectified, who remembered names and faces with a perfect recall that never faded. It is one of history's great ironies that the Emperor, who would later be accused of seeing humanity as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, spent these early years of the Imperium cultivating the loyalty of ordinary people through simple acts of attention and respect. The unification was not without its atrocities, and it would be a lie to claim otherwise. There were holdout nations who refused to surrender even when faced with annihilation, and the Emperor ordered their complete destruction not out of cruelty but out of a cold calculus that a swift, terrible example would save more lives in the long run than a protracted campaign of attrition. The siege of the Tempest Galleries lasted 3 years and claimed millions of lives before the Emperor deployed a weapon from the dark age of technology that collapsed the entire underground nation into rubble, burying defenders and civilians alike. The survivors were not permitted to rebuild. They were forcibly relocated and dispersed among other populations, their culture deliberately erased. When asked by one of his subordinates whether such measures were necessary, the Emperor is reported to have said that sentiment was a luxury the species could not afford, that every moment humanity remained divided was a moment it was vulnerable to the predators circling in the dark. And yet, for all his professed pragmatism, there were also moments of unexpected mercy. The Achaemenid Empire, a techno-theocracy that ruled much of what had once been the Middle East, surrendered after a single battle when the Emperor appeared before their ruling council and engaged them in a theological debate that lasted 18 hours, at the end of which the high priests declared that he was the divine figure their prophecies had foretold and swore fealty without another shot being fired. By the final years of the unification, Terra was his, every nation either conquered or converted, every warlord either dead or serving in his armies, every scrap of Dark Age technology catalogued and either integrated into the growing imperial war machine or destroyed if it was deemed too dangerous to preserve. The Thunder Warriors, their purpose fulfilled and their bodies beginning to fail as the genetic instability caught up with them, were quietly phased out, retired in ceremonies that honored their service before they were euthanized in medical facilities far from public view. It was a betrayal, though the Emperor would never call it that, a sacrifice of those who had served him loyally in order to make room for the next generation of soldiers who would carry his banner to the stars. The Space Marines were ready now, organized into 20 legions, each one keyed to the genetic template of a Primarch who had not yet been found. The infant Primarchs had been scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, stolen from their gestation pods in the Emperor's laboratory and flung through the warp to distant worlds where they would grow to maturity in circumstances designed to shape them in ways the Emperor had not intended. But he knew they were out there, could feel them through the psychic link that bound them to him, and once the Great Crusade began he would hunt them down one by one and bring them home. The last act of the unification was the most significant, though few at the time understood its implications. The Emperor, standing in the newly completed Sanctum Imperialis at the heart of the palace, removed the armor he had worn throughout the wars and donned robes that transformed him from a warlord into something else, something that could be called a statesman or even a priest of the state religion that was already forming around his person despite his insistence that he was not a god. He declared that Terra's age of savagery was over, that humanity would no longer turn its weapons on itself but would instead direct its might outward, reclaiming the thousands of worlds that had been cut off during the Age of Strife, bringing them back into the fold of a united humanity whether they wished it or not. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and it would be glorious and terrible and tragic in ways that not even the Emperor, for all his foresight, could fully anticipate. The Unification Wars had taken 30 years, a single generation, And in that time the Emperor had transformed a radioactive graveyard into the thrumming heart of an empire that did not yet exist but whose inevitability seemed carved into the fabric of reality itself. The Space Marines stood ready, their gene seed stabilized, their training complete, their ships fueling for journeys that would take them to the edge of the galaxy. The Mechanicum's forges on Mars burned day and night, producing weapons and armor and ammunition in quantities that staggered the imagination. The Administratum's clerks worked in their millions, organizing supply chains that would stretch across light years, ensuring that every soldier had a loss gun, every ship had Promethium, every world that was conquered could be integrated into the Imperium's economy. And at the center of it all, the Emperor stood, looking up at the stars that he had not seen clearly in 5,000 years as the warp storms that had isolated Terra finally began to calm, and he allowed himself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction or might have been dread, because he knew that the easy part was over and the true test was about to begin. The first ships to leave Terra in the opening years of the 30th millennium carried with them a hope so powerful that it bordered on religious fervor, even among those who had been taught to reject such superstitions. The warp storms had calmed, not disappeared but subsided enough that navigators could guide vessels through the currents of the Imperium without losing themselves to madness or mistranslation, and what they found when they emerged into real space was a galaxy that had suffered in isolation for 5 millennia. Human worlds had regressed to feudalism or worse, their populations huddling in ruins they could no longer repair, worshipping machines they no longer understood, preyed upon by xeno-species that had flourished in humanity's absence. The Emperor had given his legions a mandate that was simple in its clarity and apocalyptic in its scope. Bring every human world into compliance with the Imperium, exterminate any xeno-species that posed a threat to humanity's survival, and do it with such speed and totality that the galaxy would remember for the rest of time that mankind's dominion was not a request but an inevitability. The early campaigns were stunning in their success, worlds falling to the Imperium sometimes without a shot being fired, their populations welcoming the Space Marines as liberators or angels descended from ancient myth. The Luna Wolves, first among equals in those early days, established a reputation for swift, brutal warfare that ended conflicts before they could become protracted. The Imperial Fists fortified every world they conquered, turning them into bulwarks that could never be retaken. The Ultramarines did not merely conquer but built infrastructure, leaving behind functioning governments and supply chains that integrated conquered worlds into the Imperium with administrative efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. The discovery of the first Primarch was a moment of triumph that validated everything the Emperor had worked toward, proof that even the schemes of the Chaos Gods could not ultimately thwart his will. Horus was found on Chthoniya, a hive world where he had risen to prominence as a gang leader before unifying the planet through a combination of charisma and calculated violence. The Emperor descended from orbit alone, walking through the hab-blocks and industrial sectors until he stood before Horus in a confrontation that by all logic should have ended in violence but instead ended in recognition. Horus looked into the Emperor's eyes and saw the father he had never known, and the Emperor looked at Horus and saw not just the genetic legacy he had created but a son in every sense that mattered. The reunion was repeated across the galaxy as each Primarch was found, each one a different story of survival and triumph against impossible odds. Leman Russ had become a king among the feral tribes of Fenris, leading them with a warrior's honor and a wolf's cunning. Fulgrim had elevated the dying world of Chemos from collapse to prosperity through sheer determination and an obsession with perfection. Lion L. Johnson had fought his way out of the Death World forests of Caliban and risen to lead the knightly orders that protected that planet's people. Each Primarch took command of their legion, and the Great Crusade accelerated, the pace of conquest becoming almost frenzied as the Emperor's sons competed to bring the most worlds into compliance, to prove their worth not just to their father but to each other. But the Crusade was not a story of unblemished heroism, and even in those early years there were signs that the dream of unity carried within it the seeds of nightmare. The Interrex, a human civilization that had survived the age of strife intact and had even managed to coexist with xeno-species through mutual respect and carefully maintained treaties, was destroyed not because they posed a threat but because their very existence contradicted the imperial truth. the Emperor's doctrine that humanity must stand alone. That alliances with aliens were a weakness that would inevitably lead to exploitation or corruption. The Warhounds, later to be renamed the World Eaters, began to show signs of instability as their pre-March Ongron, bitter and broken from decades of slavery on Nuceria, ordered the implantation of the Butcher's Nails, crude neural implants that turned his warriors into frothing berserkers who could barely distinguish friend from foe in the heat of battle. The Emperor knew about the nails, saw what they were doing to Ongron and his legion, and did nothing, perhaps believing that the short-term gain in shock assault capability outweighed the long-term psychological cost, or perhaps simply unwilling to invest the effort required to save a son who did not wish to be saved. The Night Lords brought worlds into compliance through Terra campaigns so extreme that entire populations would surrender at the mere rumor of their approach, their pre-March Conrad Kurz justifying every atrocity as a pragmatic choice that saved more lives than it cost, and the Emperor allowed it because the results were undeniable even if the methods were monstrous. 2 centuries into the Great Crusade, the Imperium had grown beyond anything the Emperor had initially envisioned, encompassing not thousands but hundreds of thousands of worlds, its borders pushing ever outward into the dark spaces between the stars. The Primarchs had become legends in their own time, each one commanding resources and manpower that dwarfed the entirety of the Unification Wars, and the bonds between them had deepened into genuine brotherhood for some, bitter rivalry for others. Horus was the first among equals, named Warmaster by the Emperor himself in a ceremony on Ullanor after the greatest Orc empire the galaxy had seen in millennia was crushed, the honor recognizing not just his battlefield prowess but his diplomatic skill, his ability to mediate between his more difficult brothers and keep the crusade moving forward even when personalities clashed and egos threatened to derail entire campaigns. Sanguinius, the Angel, was beloved by all, his presence a calming influence that could diffuse tensions before they escalated to violence, his wings and golden hair making him seem like something out of ancient Terran mythology brought to life. Guilliman organized, building not just an empire but the systems that would allow that empire to function, his realm of Ultramar serving as a test case for how the Imperium should govern its worlds, with local autonomy balanced against centralized oversight, with taxes collected efficiently and spent on infrastructure rather than being siphoned off by corrupt officials. Dorn was the Emperor's Praetorian, stoic and unyielding, the one Primarch who seemed to understand that the Crusade would someday end and that when it did, the Imperium would need defenders more than conquerors. And then the Emperor returned to Terra and refused to explain why. It was the beginning of the end, though none of them knew it at the time. He simply announced that the Crusade would continue under Horus's command, that the Primarchs were to prosecute the remaining campaigns without his direct involvement, and that he had work to do on the throne world that could not be delayed or delegated. The Primarchs, accustomed to their father's presence as a constant even when he was not physically present on the battlefield, reacted with confusion and, in some cases, anger. Horus felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders and wondered if he was truly ready to stand in the Emperor's place. Lorgar, who had spent decades building a religion around the Emperor despite explicit orders to cease such activities, saw the withdrawal as evidence that his father was ascending to true godhood and redoubled his forbidden worship. Perturabo, bitter at being assigned the grinding siege warfare that earned no glory while his brothers won accolades for grand campaigns, felt abandoned and began to question why he should continue to sacrifice his legion for an empire that showed him no appreciation. Mortarion, who had never fully trusted the Emperor after being denied the chance to kill his adoptive father on Barbarous, saw the withdrawal as proof that the Emperor cared only for his great works and not for the sons who carried out his will. The seeds of resentment, planted in the earliest days of the Crusade and carefully ignored or minimized, began to sprout in the darkness of the Emperor's absence. The truth of what the Emperor was doing on Terra was known to almost no one, and those who did know were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. Beneath the Imperial Palace, far below the inhabited levels, far below even the deepest dungeons and storage vaults, he was constructing the Imperial Webway, a tunnel through reality that would connect Terra to the ancient Eldari network and allow humanity to travel the galaxy without ever touching the warp. It was the culmination of everything he had worked toward, the final piece of the puzzle that would free humanity from its dependence on navigators, from its vulnerability to demonic incursion, from the predations of the entities that dwelt in the Imperium and fed on human suffering like parasites. If he could complete it, the Imperium would be invincible, not just a political entity but a new phase of human evolution, a species that had outgrown the weaknesses that had nearly destroyed it during the Age of Strife. But the work was agonizingly slow and demanded his constant attention. His psychic might the only thing holding the tunnel stable as he carved it inch by inch through the webbing of unreality. He could not risk telling his sons what he was doing because knowledge of the webway's existence would draw the attention of the Chaos Gods, who would do anything to prevent humanity from escaping their influence. And so he worked in secret, trusting that the Primarchs were mature enough to handle his absence, that the bonds of brotherhood and duty he had forged between them would hold the Imperium together until his great work was complete. It was, perhaps, the greatest mistake of his impossibly long life, the single miscalculation that would doom everything he had built and condemn him to an eternity of suffering. Because while he worked beneath the palace, alone in the dark with only servitors and mute custodians for company, the Chaos Gods turned their full attention to the Primarch who carried the most potential for corruption, the one whose pride and love for his father could be most easily twisted into bitterness and rage. They whispered to Horus in the darkness of the warp, showed him visions of a future where he was forgotten, where the Emperor sat as a god while his sons were discarded like broken tools, and slowly, carefully, with a patience born of timeless malevolence, they turned the War Master from the path of duty to the road of damnation. Istvan III was supposed to be a simple compliance action, a world that had rejected imperial rule and needed to be brought back into the fold through the application of overwhelming force, nothing that a combined force of 4 legions could not handle in a matter of weeks. The Luna Wolves, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters deployed to the surface in strength, their loyalist elements concentrated in the first wave while those who had already sworn themselves to Horus's rebellion held back in orbit, waiting for the signal that would transform a campaign of reconquest into a massacre of brotherhood. The virus bombs fell from the sky like rain, canisters of weaponized contagion that burst over the cities and military installations where the Loyalists were concentrated, releasing a plague so virulent that it killed every living thing it touched within seconds, from baseline humans to the transhuman space marines in their sealed armor, the virus eating through ceramite and plasteel as if they were paper. The dying screamed into their vox grills as their organs liquefied and their skin sloughed off in sheets, and then the firestorm came, the gases released by trillions of decomposing bodies igniting in a planetary conflagration that burned hot enough to melt stone and turn sand to glass. But the virus did not kill everyone, could not kill everyone, because some of the Loyalists had taken shelter in structures deep enough or shielded well enough to withstand the initial bombardment, and when they emerged into the ash-choked aftermath they knew with absolute certainty that they had been betrayed, that the commanders they had followed for centuries had marked them for death simply because they would not turn traitor. The battle that followed lasted months, a grinding urban nightmare in the ruins of cities turned to charnel houses, Loyalists fighting with the desperation of those who know there is no retreat and no surrender, while the traitors discovered that killing brothers was not as easy as they had been promised. The word spread slowly at first and then with the speed of a wildfire jumping from ship to ship through the Vox networks and astropathic choirs, whispers that became shouts that became undeniable fact. Horus had turned against the Emperor, and he had convinced half the legions to follow him into rebellion. The galaxy, which had seemed on the verge of being unified under imperial rule, fractured along fault lines that had been invisible until the moment they tore everything apart. The Alpha Legion vanished into the shadows, their loyalties ambiguous and their actions inscrutable. The Thousand Suns, already reeling from the assault on Prospero, where the Space Wolves had nearly annihilated them on the Emperor's orders for their perceived dabbling in forbidden sorcery, saw the heresy as proof that the Imperium was rotten from its core and threw their lot in with Horus. The Word-bearers, who had been secretly worshipping the Chaos Gods for decades after their pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror, revealed themselves as the architects of the entire conspiracy, the ones who had poisoned Horus's mind and spread the corruption through carefully placed chaplains in every legion. The Night Lords followed Kurz into rebellion not because they believed in Horus's cause, but because they saw the Imperium's hypocrisy laid bare and decided that if the galaxy was going to burn, they might as well be the ones holding the torch. Ongran led the World Eaters into the heresy with the enthusiasm of someone finally given permission to indulge every violent impulse without consequence, the butcher's nails singing in his skull as he waded through oceans of blood. The Loyalists reeled, their forces scattered across the galaxy and unable to coordinate a unified response as the warp storms that had calmed during the Crusade suddenly intensified, cutting off entire sectors and making astropathic communication unreliable at best. The Ultramarines, the largest legion and the one that should have been the Imperium's greatest asset, found themselves trapped in the Kolth system by the Word-Bearers, who had lured them into a trap and then shattered the system's sun to create a warp rift that would take years to escape. The Blood Angels raced back toward Terra only to be diverted by distress calls and demonic incursions that seemed almost deliberately designed to delay them, as if the galaxy itself was conspiring to keep them from reaching the throne world in time. The Dark Angels discovered that their own homeworld of Caliban had rebelled, half the Legion siding with Luther against Lion L. Johnson, and the civil war that erupted between them would end with Caliban itself being torn apart, fragments of the planet scattered through the warp to become a fleet of mobile fortresses drifting through the Eye of Terror. The Iron Hands threw themselves at the traitors with such fury that they walked into an ambush on Istvan V, the drop site massacre where Loyalist legions were slaughtered by the traitors they had trusted to stand beside them, the Iron Tenth decimated and their pre-march Ferrus Manus beheaded by Fulgrim in a duel that symbolized how completely the bonds of brotherhood had been severed. Beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor fought a war that no one else could see. His psychic might the only thing standing between Terra and the demonic invasion that sought to pour through the breach in the webway. Magnus the Red, pre-march of the Thousand Suns, had tried to warn his father about Horus's treachery by using sorcery to punch through the psychic wards protecting the webway project, and in doing so had shattered the barriers that kept the Imperium at bay, allowing demons to flood into the tunnels the Emperor had spent decades constructing. The Emperor had no choice but to abandon his work and instead focus on containment, sitting upon the Golden Throne, the ancient device of Eldari origin that allowed him to channel his psychic power with precision enough to hold the demonic tide at bay while Custodians and Sisters of Silence died in their thousands fighting an endless defensive battle in tunnels where reality itself was more suggestion than law. He could not leave, could not risk the demons breaking through into the palace proper and from there into Terra, and so he fought in silence while the galaxy burned. His dream of a humanity free from the warp dying chamber by chamber as the tunnels he had built were overrun or sealed off and abandoned. It was during this siege that he must have understood the full scope of his failure, that his secrecy and his arrogance and his refusal to treat his sons as anything more than tools had created the conditions for their fall, and that whatever the outcome of the heresy, the future he had envisioned was already lost. The siege of Terra began with the arrival of the traitor fleets, hundreds of thousands of ships dropping out of the warp at the edge of the Sol system and beginning the slow, grinding advance toward humanity's birth world. Horus had brought a force large enough to conquer a dozen sectors, Titans walking beside corrupted space marines, demons manifesting in numbers that turned the void itself black with their presence, and mortal traitors drawn from every part of the Imperium who had decided that the Emperor's vision had failed and that Horus offered something better or at least something different. The void battles lasted weeks, the Loyalist fleets commanded by Rogel Dorn holding the line with a tenacity that bordered on the supernatural, every ship that was lost taking a dozen traitor vessels with it, every defense platform fighting until its ammunition was exhausted and then ramming enemy ships in final acts of defiance. But numbers and momentum favored the traitors, and eventually the outer defenses were breached, and the war came to Terra itself. The Imperial Palace, that continent-sized fortress that had been built to withstand the end of the world, became the last bastion of Loyalist resistance, its walls lined with defenders who knew that if they fell there would be no retreat, no last-ditch defense, only extinction. The traitors threw themselves at the walls with waves of infantry supported by armor and titans, and the Loyalists held, not because they were stronger or more skilled but because they had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. The battle raged for 55 days, and by the end Terra was a mass grave, its surface cratered by orbital bombardment and macroweapons, its hives burning, its population reduced by billions. Inside the palace, defenders fought in corridors choked with the dead, ran out of ammunition and resorted to combat knives and fists, held rooms for hours or days before being overwhelmed and falling back to the next fortified position. The traitor primarchs led from the front, Ongron ascending to demonhood in the middle of the siege and becoming an avatar of Khorne's bloodlust, Fulgrim having already transformed into something that was more demon than human, Mortarion spreading plagues that killed as efficiently as any weapon. And then Horus dropped the palace's void shields, not through assault but through treachery, one of the shield operators turning traitor at a critical moment, and the Emperor saw his opening. He could not leave the throne, could not abandon his vigil against the demons in the webway, but if Horus believed the palace was about to fall, he might lower his guard, might allow himself a moment of triumph, and in that moment he would be vulnerable. The Emperor gambled everything on a single teleport assault, taking with him a handful of his best warriors, including Sanguinius and Rogel Dorn, materializing aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, in what would be the final confrontation of the heresy. What happened in the throne room of the Vengeful Spirit is known only through fragmentary accounts, survivors' testimony filtered through trauma and the unreliability of memory. Sanguinius reached Horus first and fought his brother in a duel that should have been glorious but was instead simply sad, the angel refusing to strike with lethal intent because he still hoped some fragment of the old Horus remained, and Horus killed him for that mercy, tearing his wings and breaking his body in an act of fratricide so complete that it shattered whatever remained of the War Master's humanity. The Emperor arrived to find his most beloved son dead at the feet of his most favored son, and for the first time in his long existence he felt something that might have been pure rage. The duel between father and son was not a contest of skill but of wills, psychic might clashing with warp-gifted power, the Emperor holding back because he could not bring himself to destroy what remained of Horus, and Horus exploiting that hesitation to wound the Emperor so grievously that his immortal flesh began to fail. It was only when a lone guardsman, some nameless soldier who had been caught up in the teleport and who would never be identified, threw himself at Horus in a futile gesture of defiance and was obliterated for his courage, that the Emperor understood there was nothing of his son left to save. The psychic assault that followed unmade Horus at a level beyond mere physical death, erasing his soul so completely that not even the Chaos Gods could resurrect him. But the cost was the Emperor's own mortality, his body ruined beyond even his ability to heal, his psychic essence hemorrhaging out into the warp. They carried him back to Terra on a litter borne by weeping custodians, his body so damaged that it was unclear if he was alive or if what animated him was simply the last firing of neurons in a brain that refused to accept death. The Golden Throne, which had been a tool for channeling his psychic might into the webway, became a life support system of last resort, its alien mechanisms barely understood by the tech priests who frantically worked to reconfigure it, to transform it from a weapon into a prison that could keep the Emperor's soul anchored to his failing flesh. Rogel Dorn, who had found his father in the ruins of the Vengeful Spirit and who had seen the light fading from eyes that had witnessed the birth of civilization, made the decision that would define the next 10,000 years. The Emperor would be interred upon the throne, his suffering prolonged indefinitely because the alternative was the extinction of the species. No one asked the Emperor if this was what he wanted, if an eternity of agony was preferable to the clean release of death, and perhaps that is the truest measure of how far the Imperium had fallen from his vision, that his own servants would sentence him to damnation out of fear and desperation rather than respect his autonomy. The moment the throne systems engaged, the moment his consciousness was fully integrated into the arcane machinery, the Astronomicon flared to life with a brilliance that could be perceived across half the galaxy, a psychic lighthouse burning in the warp with such intensity that navigators wept at its beauty and its pain. The Imperium that survived the heresy was a shattered thing, barely recognizable as the gleaming vision the Emperor had built during the Great Crusade. Entire legions were gone, their gene seed lost or corrupted, their histories stricken from the record so thoroughly that even their names became forbidden. The surviving loyalist legions were broken apart in the Second Founding, divided into chapters of 1,000 warriors each so that no single commander could ever again wield the power that Horus had turned to treachery. The Space Marines, who had once been conquerors and explorers, became reactive defenders, their purpose reduced to holding the line against an endless tide of enemies that grew stronger with each passing century. The imperial truth, the emperor's doctrine of rationalism and atheism, was abandoned almost immediately, replaced by the imperial cult, a religion that worshipped the emperor as a god despite the fact that he had spent his entire existence denying his divinity. The ecclesiarchy grew from scattered cults into a monolithic institution that commanded resources and manpower rivaling the Astra Militarum, its priests preaching a gospel of suffering and martyrdom that transformed the emperor's vision of an enlightened humanity into a nightmare of superstitious zealotry. The Inquisition emerged from the shadows as an organization with the authority to execute anyone, from the lowliest laborer to the highest lord, if they were suspected of heresy or corruption, and the definition of heresy was flexible enough to encompass almost any behavior that deviated from orthodoxy. 10,000 years is a span of time so vast that it defies human comprehension, longer than all of recorded history, long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall in the spaces between the Imperium's notice. And throughout all of it, the Emperor has endured, his body held in stasis on the Golden Throne, his psychic presence a constant scream that resonates through the warp whether anyone is listening or not. Every day, 1,000 psychers are brought before the throne, their souls fed into the machinery that keeps him alive, their psychic essence consumed to fuel the Astronomicon and to sustain the Emperor's battle against the demons that still claw at the breach in the webway. The psychers go to their deaths with prayers on their lips, told that they are serving the God Emperor and that their sacrifice will earn them a place at his side in the afterlife, though whether this is true or simply a comforting lie is something no one can say with certainty. The process is efficient and industrial, a conveyor belt of souls ground up in the machinery of the Imperium survival, and it has continued without interruption for 10 millennia because the alternative is the death of Terra and the collapse of the Imperium into isolated fragments that would be devoured within a generation. There are moments when the Emperor seems to act, when events unfold in ways that suggest a guiding intelligence behind them, and these moments are seized upon by the faithful as proof of his continued divinity. The living saints, individuals who manifest powers far beyond what their station or training should allow, appear in moments of crisis and turn the tide of battles that seemed lost, and they speak of visions of the Emperor guiding their actions, of feeling his presence like a warm light in their minds. Entire wars have been won by last-minute reinforcements arriving exactly when and where they were needed, by astropathic messages getting through warp storms that should have blocked all communication, by weapons malfunctioning at critical moments to save loyalist forces from annihilation. The Emperor's Tarot, a divination tool used by the Inquisition and certain branches of the Administratum, produces readings that sometimes align with events so precisely that it seems impossible to dismiss as mere chance. But for every miracle there are a dozen tragedies, planets that cry out for aid and are not answered, heroes who fall in battles that a moment of divine intervention could have prevented, innocents who suffer and die in wars that grind on for decades without resolution. If the Emperor still possesses agency, if he is capable of influencing events beyond the simple fact of his psychic presence powering the Astronomicon, then he is selective about when and how he acts, or perhaps the effort of intervening in real space is so immense that he can only manage it rarely, burning reserves of strength that take years or centuries to accumulate. The question of what the Emperor has become is one that theologians and heretics debate in equal measure, though the consequences for being wrong differ dramatically. The orthodox position, enforced by the ecclesiarchy with fire and blade, is that he is a god, that his suffering on the throne is a form of eternal sacrifice that redeems humanity's sins, and that to question his divinity is to court damnation. The radical position, whispered in the shadows by those who remember the imperial truth or who have access to records from before the heresy, is that he is still a man, albeit one with powers that approach the divine, and that the worship directed at him is exactly the kind of superstitious regression he fought against during the unification. There is a third position, rarely spoken aloud because it is so profoundly unsettling, which suggests that the Emperor is undergoing a transformation, that 10,000 years of psychic suffering and the worship of trillions of faithful have been changing him at a fundamental level, that he is slowly becoming the god that the Imperium believes him to be, not through any choice of his own but through a process of apotheosis fueled by collective belief and desperate prayer. If this is true, then the being that sits on the golden throne may no longer be the emperor who walked among his legions during the crusade, may not even possess continuity of consciousness with that individual, but may instead be something new, something that wears the emperor's identity like a mask while possessing motivations and perceptions that are utterly alien to baseline human understanding. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is a monument to decay, a civilization that has forgotten how to innovate and can only maintain what it has inherited through ritual and rote repetition. The standard template constructs that once allowed colonists to build advanced technology from scratch are lost or hoarded by the Mechanicum, who treat them as holy relics rather than tools to be used and improved. The warp routes that connect the Imperium's million worlds are increasingly unstable, travel times that once took weeks now taking months or years, and entire sectors going dark as warp storms swallow them whole. The armies of the Astra Militarum march off to wars that will outlive their grandchildren, their equipment produced in manufactorums that have been running the same patterns for 5,000 years without anyone understanding why the designs were made that way or if they could be improved. The population of the Imperium is counted in quadrillions, but the vast majority live lives of grinding poverty and servitude, their only purpose to feed the war machine with their labor and their bodies, to die in the manufactorums or on the battlefields or in the holds of ships transporting them from one site of suffering to another. This is the civilization the Emperor built, or at least the civilization that was built in his name, and it is impossible to know what he thinks of it as he sits in silent agony, if he is proud that humanity has survived or horrified at what it has become in order to do so. There are prophecies scattered throughout the Imperium's texts, visions recorded by astropaths and saints and madmen, that speak of an end to the Emperor's vigil. Some say that he will rise from the throne renewed, that his healing is nearly complete, and that the day is coming when he will walk among his people again and lead them to a new golden age. Others say that he will die, that the throne will finally fail, or that the accumulated damage to his body will reach a threshold beyond which even the throne systems cannot sustain him, and that his death will trigger a psychic event so catastrophic that it will tear the galaxy in half. There are even those who say that he is already dead, that the being sustaining the Astronomicon is not the Emperor but a psychic echo, a recording of his power imprinted into the warp that continues to function even though the consciousness that created it is long gone. The Inquisition hunts down those who spread such prophecies, executing them as heretics, but the whispers persist because uncertainty is the only honest response to a situation that has endured for 10,000 years without resolution. The truth is that no one knows what will happen when the Emperor's vigil ends, if it ever does, and that uncertainty is both the Imperium's greatest fear and its most sustaining hope. In the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, in rooms that have not been entered in millennia and which are sealed behind doors that require the authority of the High Lords to open, there are said to be preparations for the Emperor's death. Stasis vaults containing genetic samples, data cores with psychic imprints, cloning facilities that have been maintained by servitors who do not understand what they are preserving or why. There are those who believe that the Emperor has a contingency, that his foresight extended even to his own incapacitation, and that somewhere in the labyrinth of the palace there are instructions for what to do when the throne fails, a way to resurrect him or to transfer his consciousness into a new vessel or to complete the transformation into full divinity that some believe he has been undergoing. But these are rumors built on rumors, the kind of desperate hope that sentient beings cling to when faced with the prospect of oblivion, and the reality is likely far more banal, that the Imperium will continue as it has, grinding forward through sheer institutional momentum, until the day it cannot, and then it will collapse with a speed that will shock those who believed it eternal. The Emperor endures because he must, because the alternative is unthinkable, and because after 10,000 years of suffering the concept of release has become more terrifying than the agony of continuation. He is the Imperium's foundation and its prisoner, its god and its greatest victim, And his story is not one of triumph or tragedy but of endurance, the simple fact of lasting when every rational calculation says that lasting should be impossible, of holding the line not because there is hope of victory, but because the act of holding the line has become its own purpose, its own justification, its own terrible and magnificent meaning.